Hello and welcome to episode 225 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast and the third episode in our series Connection and Disconnection in Remote Teams. Today's episode looks at the impact of loneliness and disconnection in the widest sense on health, on productivity, and even on our community, society, and economy. But before I hand you over to Bree Caggiati and a very decent group of returning guests, I just want to give a quick shout out to listeners who've been following the podcast over the last two episodes of this series, because there's been quite a lot of reaction. So I just want to say, keep them coming, keep your feedback, your thoughts coming. And I'm only recording this a day after episode 2 was released, so I will miss a lot. So thank you if you shared our episode, just blankly. Thank you very much. And these are some of the comments that I picked up along the way, mainly on social media. So Roberta Sawatsi over on LinkedIn said about episode 1, Pilar, Tim, Maya, Bree, thanks for an excellent podcast filled with so many takeaways. Lots of issues identified, paving the way for great conversations as the series continues. And then she made a little nudge to the fact that Bree has just moved to Canada. She said, welcome to Canada, Bree. And thanks to regular listener Alon Shevat, who shared again the first episode on Twitter with a very concise comment, which personally meant a lot to me. It said, excellent. Loyal listener Teresa Sigilito Hollema, also past guest on this show, said, interesting first podcast of the series Connection and Disconnection in Remote Teams. And she quoted, we can listen to our bodies to inform of us how we're doing when we work alone. Then Rowena Hennigan on the second episode, she's also been on the show, she said, what a lineup, looking forward to listening to this one. I think the topic barriers to connection is well chosen and very pertinent. So thank you. It's just great to hear that, yes, this is something that is resonating. And then from past guest also, Katrina Valette Carbonell, something came through on Twitter. She said, I really enjoyed your discussion on connection and disconnection and loneliness as a remote worker. As my commute is close to zero, I don't often have the time to listen to your podcast, but I had to travel today without the kids. 3 hours of learning while driving. Thank you. And it does make me think we should bring back the commute so people have time to listen to podcasts, which wouldn't be very popular. We've also had guests, shares from the guests. So thank you very much, guests, for taking part, of course, but also for helping us to broaden our audience. And I've just picked up these couple ones. Brian Rhea, he listened to the first episode, which he wasn't directly involved in, and he posted in the community virtual team talk, which is actually featured in episode 222. So remember, we are alternating this series with our regular schedule. So our last other multi-guest episode, as I'm recording this, was 222 on online communities. And Brian posted inside of Virtual Team Talk, he said, I was just listening to the first episode of Connection and Disconnection at the gym, not at the commute, and it was such a fantastic conversation. So thank you. It's always really interesting to hear where these podcasts are being listened to, where these episodes are being listened to. And then Teresa Douglas, who's also she's also been on the show before, and she's a regular guest of this series. She said after seeing the episode image for episode 2, she said, it's a remote worker buffet. And when I laughed at that on Twitter, she said, I'm in week 5 of my run training, so everything is about food. And finally, even my mother WhatsApped me just to say, after listening to the second episode, she said, what a full-on job bringing all these people together. So well done, Bree, for that. So thank you very much for telling us you're listening. And I think also it's very interesting to think of podcasts as a point of connection. This is, of course, something we're thinking a lot at Virtual Not Distant at the moment, how to help organizations build their sense of community and belonging through podcasts, through podcasting. But on a broader sense, sometimes I like to think that this show helps people to stay connected with each other who otherwise wouldn't be. So thank you very much. It really means a lot to us. So if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. You are listening to the 21st Century Work Life podcast, which is a show about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and how distributed organizations are evolving. And the company behind this podcast is Virtual Not Distant, and I'm its director. My name is Pilar Orti. Hello. And we exist to help managers and their teams transition to an office optional approach. You can find everything about us over at virtualnotdistant.com. And also there is the contact form where we would be delighted to read your feedback. So the episode you're listening to now is a part of a 7-episode series, which we are creating in collaboration with Shield GEO. They're driving this process, I have to say. And they are a distributed company that helps organizations to employ people internationally. That's by looking after the tax, after the payroll, basically simplifying the process of having an employee in a different country. So indeed, Bree Caggiati, as I was saying, is driving this series. So I'm going to leave you now in her very capable hosting hands, and I'll pop in back at the end of the episode to remind you how you can get in touch. Enjoy.
Welcome back to Connection and Disconnection in Remote Teams. As always, I'm your host, Bree Caggiati, and thank you so much for joining us again. Today, we're looking at what happens when we find ourselves disconnected and how this can impact not only our emotional well-being, but further afield. We'll cover the physical health implications, economic impacts, and what happens in our relationships, both at home and in the workplace. But first, we're going to start by hearing from Dr. Julianne Hold-Lunstad on why we feel lonely in the first place.
This idea really stems from this idea that humans are social creatures. We're social animals. And much like other kinds of social animals, that we thrive in groups, and that being part of a group is adaptive for survival. You can think across lots of species where being part of a group is adaptive, not only from a safety kind of standpoint, but also pooling of resources. So being part of a group not only helps us manage risk, but also manage effort. And so it's argued that loneliness is a biological drive, much like hunger or thirst. And so hunger motivates us to seek out food, or thirst motivates us to seek out water, and that loneliness motivates us to seek out our relationships. So, in each case, they're this kind of unpleasant state, but nonetheless pushes us in the direction. Some also have compared it to pain. Physical pain is this unpleasant state, but is highly motivating. If we had our hand on a hot stove, that it's that pain that motivates us to remove it, to prevent tissue damage. And so even though no one likes to experience pain is awful, it nonetheless is incredibly important for survival. And in fact, there's some neuroscience evidence to suggest that the neural pathways for physical pain and social pain carry similar pathways. And so what this suggests is that loneliness may be adaptive in the long run.
I found this description of loneliness really interesting, particularly in the light of building up those self-reflection practices, which is something that we've been speaking about in our earlier episodes. We found that it's not often until we start feeling the effects of loneliness that we even notice it at all, which makes picking up on it before it reaches that chronic stage really difficult. Sometimes we even resist facing that niggle inside of us that's trying to push us towards connecting, like Julianne suggested, simply because we're lazy. We don't want to put in the effort. It's like picking up takeout even though you have a full fridge of healthy food at home, which I think is something we can all relate to. Developer Brian Rhea talks about this in the context of resisting meetings and collaboration in the workplace. It's something we know will be helpful in the long run, but often feels disruptive because it just requires a little bit more effort.
I think the way that I would put it is that it's It's definitely human nature to need it. I don't necessarily know that it's always human nature to seek it out and find it, especially when, gosh, what's the best way to put this? That we're also at our nature very easily distracted by things that feel good in the short term but are bad for us in the long term. And so, I mean, as an introvert, I really, really like having some alone time. Well, if I get too much of that, even if I want it right now, over time, I'm not going to have a community that can support me and that I can give back to. I think it's a matter of like, look, sometimes meetings and having a conversation and thinking and working through something with somebody else, it is just harder and more inconvenient than to struggle through it and do it myself. Like that is just something that we have to acknowledge. Sometimes meetings are more inconvenient. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have them. And so I think that it's just kind of all tangled up in that whole what I want right now and what's easiest right now is not best for me in the long term.
Marcus Wermuth, who manages an engineering team at Buffer, makes a point that some of this resistance is due to personality. Some people only need a very small amount of conversation to feel fulfilled and connected within their team, whereas others may require lots of focused connection points throughout their day.
I think it's a thin line, especially with my team as it's an engineering team. Engineers do tend to like the downtime and focus time, which I can understand coming from that area. But I also see the need of at least a couple of connection points. And that's where there are some regular meetings, the one-on-ones, the one team call, if we can do it. But then there's time they can kind of handle on their own with other teammates. So maybe they do a one-on-one call with another engineer, but they only do it every 2 weeks or only when there's stuff on the agenda. So they kind of handle it on their own. So that's why I say it's a thin line. There's some part of a resistance to more calls, but there's also the need for wanting the connection.
But regardless of how much we actually need from our relationships to feel fulfilled, I think the key here is having that self-awareness, which is something that we keep coming back to. We need to be aware of that point in ourselves that we shouldn't cross, whether that's time-based or how we feel day to day. I do wonder what it could look like if we responded curiously to the small shifts in our feelings and behaviours, rather than waiting for them to become more significant problems. Will we perhaps begin to experience some benefits like deeper, more authentic relationships or collaborations that lead to more creative designs or business ideas or product developments? Julianne does say that there's definitely a correlation between feeling connected and an increase in our productivity, so maybe I'm not far off.
There's some really interesting research that suggests in the workplace, the more that coworkers talk and visit, and even when this was not necessarily work related, what they found was that led to greater productivity. And so the researchers suspected that this led to greater connection to not only each other, but to the job and the company, and felt a greater sense of investment into what they were working on. And so I think that we can really harness some of this research and think about ways in which we can use that and apply it in a way that helps workers' emotional and physical health as well as their productivity.
Occupational psychologist Dr. Richard McKinnon agrees, making a case for actually investing in social aspects of team dynamics instead of deterring them.
That's really important, because I think if you see social contact in the workplace as detracting from productivity, you're looking at it as a kind of a zero-sum game, and it doesn't work that way at all. These chats, these interactions contribute to team effectiveness, and they contribute to team trust and psychological safety, and it means that people are more willing to do things that are helpful to them when they need it, when there are levels of trust and familiarity there. So it's almost an investment that needs to be made. However it's made, whether it's co-located or remote using technology, whether it's a weekly and enforced or encouraged chat or not, all of those things serve to contribute to we as a team rather than I by myself.
So if we look at the flip side of this, we can start to see those potential impacts that disconnection could have on team investment and productivity as well.
So a familiar scenario I will see is someone who sees themselves as being disconnected from those around them. And what that leads to often is an unwillingness to reach out to others for support. And that leads to people being overwhelmed from a workload perspective, and then they're feeling stressed. And then you've got all of the follow-ons from that. So disconnection from others, a lack of social connection in the workplace can be the root cause for lots of the problems that make their way to my door when I sit down with someone for, say, a one-to-one coaching session. And it's important, I think, to underline that the feeling of loneliness has very little to do with being alone. It's perceptions of the quality of those relationships and of the social connections that we have. And if we rate them as being poor or absent, research has shown that can have an impact on mortality that is the equivalent of obesity or smoking. So it's at our very core that humans need this connection, and whether it's the organization that facilitates it or the individual that engages with it, we do seek it out. And when it's not there, we feel it. But whatever the root cause, this feeling of disconnection has a very negative impact on mood, on self-concept. You wonder how much of it is your fault. People do withdraw a little bit, and sometimes they withdraw some of their effort. So that discretionary effort that we give, the going the extra mile, that can suffer from that, because you might wonder to yourself, why should I bother? Those guys don't have my back. Why should I look out for them? And I have seen it lead to exit from the organization. Someone wants to find a nicer place to spend their waking hours.
Shield Geo's co-founder Tim Burgess agrees. He thinks disconnection can lead to people leaving an organization sooner.
Every relationship has little bumps in the road. And if someone's disengaged, that bump will send them off. If they're engaged, they'll have that bump in the road and they stay the course because they're like, still like the team, still like the place, still like everything else. Okay, they stuffed up this one thing with me, but I'm still here. If you're disengaged, you're like, final straw, that's it, I'm out of here.
When we work remotely, oftentimes that means working from our homes. So when we think of the flow-on effects of a person feeling isolated and disconnected, we now have to think about how that might also affect the people that they live with as well.
At the end of your workday, home is where you go to decompress, be back to who you are. It's where your authentic self lives and so on. And so the idea that you're bringing a work environment into that space is something I think you need to approach with a little caution, particularly, if you think about if you bring a toxic work environment into someone's home, just at a physical level, you're sort of invading their safe space with that. But also then, because there's less buffer between your work experience and your home experience, you don't have the commute where you get the experience of being around all of these sweaty, smelly fellow passengers to gradually, wash off work and get back to home, or navigating traffic or whatever it is, that it might be harder to make that transition. You might carry more of your work experience into your home experience. Even more so if you're a bit isolated, because you don't necessarily have colleagues, people sitting next to you on the bus. I tend to bump into some other school parents on my way home. And so there's always, you can always offload a few of your worries onto those people before you get into your house. Whereas if it's literally push the laptop down, turn around and you finish work, it's harder to do that.
Tim sees this lower barrier between work life and home life having the potential to lead to something like emotional contagion.
The basic principle is that the emotions that you experience spread a little bit to everybody you interact with. If you're in a bad mood, then everybody you bump into gets a little bit of that bad mood to varying degrees. Let's say you've got your boss as a bully and you're in a relationship. Then your partner's work colleagues' experience suffers because your boss bullies you, you feel bad, you go home in a bad mood, your partner catches that, your partner goes to work in a bad mood, their colleagues catch it, right? And, every time a little bit dampened down, even within an organization, that emotional contagion can spread. It doesn't have to have physical proximity. And so there's a famous study that Facebook did in 2014, sometime around then, where they were manipulating people's news feeds. They didn't tell them. And so they would show some people only negative news feeds and some people only positive news feeds. And then they monitored what that meant in terms of their behavior, obviously Facebook engagement with the platform and that sort of stuff. But what they found was that people who only experienced negative stuff were more negative. Their posts were more negative. The words they used were more negative. People who only experienced positive were more positive. So that's not even necessarily with human, it's a computer, but it still spreads. And I think one of the reasons we talked about this was around this concept of what's the employer's responsibility, what's in it for companies to try to help people foster this sense of connection and look after people's emotional and psychological well-being. And one of the reasons is that if you go the other way, if you foster disconnection or sort of dissonance, cognitive dissonance, then that also that will spread back.
Yeah.
Into your organization. It's not necessarily there's just going to be this one casualty. That person is going to suffer. All the people around them are also going to suffer. And the people who interact with them, at work, at home, and so on, are also going to be affected by it.
Yeah. Hopefully by now we can see that feeling disconnected isn't just a small blip in our day, but something that can have a significant impact on how we approach our work, how productive we are, how well our teams and organizations function. It can also have an impact on our relationships outside of the workplace, particularly when we are working from home and have limited distinction between when work time ends and home time begins. Well, this is certainly enough of a reason, I think, to proactively address disconnection within our teams. I want to pivot slightly and talk about some of the potentially more serious implications that can come from feeling lonely. In the previous episode, I mentioned that Julianne has spent most of her career researching the correlation between the quantity and quality of our relationships and our physical health and mortality rate. Here, she shares some of those findings with us.
Yeah, I think people recognize that our relationships might influence maybe our emotional well-being, how happy or satisfied or these more of a psychological kinds of effects. But most people don't recognize the powerful effects that it has on our actual physical health. So I've been working on research related to how our relationships influence our physical health for my entire career. So I did a lot of laboratory-based studies where I would look at various physiological markers to help explain how it is that our relationships could influence health. And I also looked at how the quality of our relationships, how that impacted it. But it really became apparent to me that outside of academia and the group of researchers and scholars that were directly studying this, that there was a real lack of recognition beyond that in terms of, just how impactful our relationships might be. And so that led me to some of my work where I analyzed basically all of the epidemiological evidence to date that had looked at the extent to which people are socially connected and how that might predict actual mortality. So who lives and dies. And what we found was that, of course, not only does it impact this, but that those who are more socially connected have a 50% increased odds of survival. Just given that we know, or that we recognize that not everyone else recognizes this and might not really be able to wrap their heads around what 50% really means practically, we benchmarked it relative to other risk factors that we take very seriously for our health. And what we found was that this was comparable, the effect that it has on our lifespan is very comparable to some of these other factors that we take very seriously for our health, including things like alcohol consumption, obesity, air pollution. We compared it to many different things, and it was quite significant. And so basically what we found was that this predicted lacking social connection would be predicting increased risk for premature mortality from all causes. And when we looked at studies that looked at specific like diseases, there was no significant difference. So it's not that this was primarily cardiovascular disease. There were a number of different kinds of diseases, and we didn't find any difference based on the actual, whether it was cardiovascular or cancer or pulmonary or whatever.
So does that mean if I had cancer, I had a better chance of survival if I have support networks than if I don't? Is that kind of the conclusions that you're drawing, or is it further than that? If I don't have connections, I'm more at risk of developing cancer or other diseases.
Right. And actually what we found was both. Regardless of whether someone was healthy or ill, people who are more socially connected lived longer.
It's important to note here that the health effects are not just reduced to diseases and concerns that are known to develop later in life. According to Julianne, we're seeing health effects among younger populations as well.
Some studies have shown increases in various markers from hypertension to inflammatory markers. And if we think about the number of diseases that are inflammatory related, there's some evidence to suggest that some of these inflammatory diseases are increasing as well. It suggests that we are going to see some of these effects at younger ages, and that we need to also take it seriously at younger ages as well, and not just assume that it's primarily something that only affects older adults.
According to figures published by the Office for National Statistics in the UK, 2.4 million British residents suffer from chronic loneliness. This vast number, combined with the findings Julianne's been speaking about, puts this issue at national health crisis level in the UK, and there's similar estimations across other Western countries as well. It really showcases just how important it is that we as a society learn how to deal effectively with experiences of disconnection in ourselves, in our teams, and in our communities at large. And unfortunately, of course, with health impacts of this magnitude, we're naturally seeing some economic ones follow as well.
There was a study done, sponsored by AARP not too long ago, that looked at the economic cost of this. And what they found was they looked at Medicare recipients. And so just among older adults who are on Medicare, what they found was that this led to, I believe it was $6.7 billion in annual Medicare costs among those who are socially isolated compared to those that are not. But I think the key here is that there may be significant economic costs associated with social isolation, and that's in terms of medical costs that is paid for by taxpayers, right? So it affects society much larger. And if we think about those economic costs, those estimates were isolated to older adults who are on Medicare. And if we think about the larger economic costs that may be borne more broadly, population-wide, those economic costs may be much larger.
We can see that this issue is much larger than our little remote work community, and is going to require effort from many different levels to address this effectively. But don't let this scare you. It's vital for us to be educated around this subject, to understand the scale of it, and I do hope that this episode encourages you to seek out even more information. Because while remote workers may be especially at risk of experiencing these feelings, I actually think we might also be uniquely positioned to address them. In the next few episodes, we're going to look into some of the solutions that each of us can implement and have some really interesting discussion around where the responsibility should lie. Once again, I'd like to finish this episode by encouraging any listeners who may be going through this right now. This isn't a shameful experience by any means, So many of us have gone through something similar, and it's really okay to ask for help if you need it. Equally, I'd like to encourage all listeners to be the one to reach out to their friends and family, to ask how they're doing and to really listen. You never know how much this could help. Once again, a huge thank you to all the guests who've spoken to me for this episode of Connection and Disconnection in Remote Teams. It's been so incredibly enriching to learn from each of you, and I'm just so thankful that you've shared your insights and expertise with me. So thank you very much for that. And of course, thank you listeners for joining us again. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and that you learnt something new. We look forward to having you along for the rest of the series. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Talk soon.
Well, listeners, I hope this has provided plenty of food for thought, and we would love to hear your reflections and your additions. I am extremely grateful to Shield Geo for taking on this mammoth project, so thank you. Listeners, get in touch through virtualnotdistant.com if you want to send me an email, Pilar, Pilar, @virtualnotdistant.com. I will share the thoughts with the rest of the team. We'd love to hear your reflections on this huge topic of connection and disconnection in remote teams.